Hello, everyone. It's great seeing such a great crowd. Thank you for coming to our last lecture of the Arts and Architecture presentation of 2021 and our series Creating the Architecture of the Monterey Peninsula. I want to thank our sponsors of tonight's lecture, North Star Construction and Alfred Seacom, right there, who built some of George Brook Kothlow's work, the Oldham Group and Compass Realty and the Pine Inn. And we conclude this year's lecture with another truly great architect of our area, George Brook Kothlow. And presenting this talk, we're really lucky to have Richard Olson. Richard spent a decade in New York in art and architecture publishing and as a senior acquisitions and development book editor for Doubleday, Rizzoli, and Harry and Abrams, and 5 years in Los Angeles as Architectural Digest senior editor for architectural coverage. He's also an independent researcher, writer, and photographer. He's edited many, many books, including Cottages by the Sea of Carmel Cottages, which many of you may know. And it included some works by, I believe, Mickey Munich and George Brook Kothlow. He also published a book called Handmade Houses, which focused on architect-done houses, and also included Brook Kothlow's work and works of Mickey Munich. His principal areas of study and documentation are environmental practice in the design, technology, and construction of California's custom single-family house and late 19th century to the present. And he has done a lot of research and documentation on George's work, and much of it will be included in the culmination of a lot of these efforts in the last 15 years for him, which is the forthcoming Rizzoli commissioned book, California Green, Environmentalism of the House. So we're lucky to have someone who knows George and loves George's work so much here to present it to us. Richard Olson, thank you.
Thank you for coming out to celebrate the work of George Brook Kothlow. This evening, we're going to look at the underpinnings of George's approach to the work. We're going to look at a highlight reel of it, built and unbuilt. And lastly, we're going to consider his most iconic efforts, and singular efforts, his bridge timber designs of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and place them in the historical context of the bridge timber house overall. So I found that it could be rather difficult to get George to elucidate what defined his particular approach to architecture. To get anywhere, I had to wear him down, but still I never felt like I got what I was after. Typically, he would share some hints and then leave it to me to put together the whole picture. In the 70s, publicly for the Herald and the Pinecone, he did open up a bit. In those few instances, he consistently spoke of his approach being concerned with organic principles, with the honest expression of structure and material, and of striving for a subdued and understated presence contextually. Some of those labels apply to his own personal style. He himself was understated, and certainly from the perspective of self-promotion. Even his associate architect struggled with him in this regard. In the late 70s, when asked about his irreducibles by his then new associate architect, David Martin, George answered only that David ought to look at his drawings, or for directional clues as to influence, to look at the work of his former employer, Warren Callister. George was a relatively quiet, laid-back, reserved, and physically unimposing man who, ironically in his work, frequently presented only the image of strength and outward assuredness. But he didn't write and publish about the work. He didn't teach as a way of furthering awareness and influence of his approach to the work. He didn't hire publicists. It was all kind of typically Scandinavian and typically George. The story to be heard, the truth, was always right there in the work itself. And for him, that was enough. So yes, some excavating work of George's approach is a necessity. And it's the primary purpose of my talk this evening. Due to constraints of time, we'll bypass some of the more interesting, wider cultural factors, the consumer culture of the 50s, the 60s environmental movement, especially in the San Francisco Bay region, and the Vietnam War, that most certainly shaped his approach. Instead, I'm going to focus on three topics. First is his architectural philosophy, then structure and form, then materials. So George received a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Colorado at Boulder in '62, leading up to which he worked in the Colorado Springs office of Ingraham and Ingraham, the firm of Frank Lloyd Wright's granddaughter, Elizabeth Wright Ingraham, and her husband, also an architect. As part of George's UC Boulder fifth-year architectural thesis, he was required to outline his philosophical viewpoints. In that document, he writes, as you see here, architecture as art. Architecture as art is a creation of the soul, speaking to the souls of other men. I'm going to get to this part in a second. The artist must approach an architectural problem as if it were a work of art. The nature of the problem or a knowledge of all factors present is to be established. During this stage of absorption in the problem, the imagination, consciously and unconsciously, is at work involving a concept that is based upon the principles and ideals of the artist. The realization of the concept in material form follows. He then goes on, as you see, many buildings are constructed under the name of architecture, but exist in reality to be no more than architectural deceptions. Architecture is more than just building in space. Its true meaning is found by the passage of time. Architecture must have all the recognizable qualities of art to exist as art. So if George hadn't arrived at these beliefs regarding architecture as art on his own from his time at UC Boulder, certainly it would have been otherwise instilled in him by the Ingrahams. Gordon Ingraham had met Elizabeth Wright while each was attending the apprentice program of Taliesin, Wright's architecture school in the late 1930s. Ingraham and Ingraham, during George's tenure there, and for the majority of the firm's existence, worked strictly in the Wrightian organic mode of architecture being the mother art. My point of emphasis here, besides the fact that up until his final project, George would remain steadfast in the approach to architectural problem solving and conceptualization that he described in his '62 UC Boulder thesis, is George's attachment to the concept of architecture as art. It would be accurate to say that most, if not all, ambitious young architects approach practice as an art first and a business second. And as they mature and take their lumps, this stance tends to the very least mellow. George, on the other hand, for the entirety of his career, largely held on to this ideal as one of his basic truths. Architecture being an art was a guiding principle in his decision-making, both creatively, from the plan system to the construction system to the detail system, and in practical business terms. Architecture as art. We know there's a long history of architects looking to artists for inspiration. And I would venture looking with not a little envy. It could be argued that Frank Gehry, who has in fact said he sees himself as a sculptor, successfully crossed over to the other side. Of course, the painter or sculptor in creating his works doesn't deal with compromise, at least in terms of the conceptualization of a work. He isn't creating for practical use, nor does he typically work by committee. By contrast, the architect, whether the artist architect or the architect businessman, deals in an additive process that is a cobweb of compromise, as it is service-based, one that is dependent upon the input of other parties for its realization. George's vision of architecture as art, as opposed to architecture as business, was a stance. It's a stance that, as it deals in subjectivity, can easily find itself in perilous opposition with the tastes and practical needs or desires of the client. For George, as for Mark Mills, as for Marcel Sedletsky, for Mickey Munig, and for so many other uncompromising artist architects whose works we know, architecture as an art was a costly commitment in terms of securing and keeping clients. A second fundamental part of George's architectural philosophy is the example of his only post-university time in an architectural office, Charles Warren Callister and Associates in Marin County. During George's 4 years with Callister from '62 to '66, if he didn't receive direct mentoring from the boss, the Callister example possessed the kind of clarity of messaging and enough excitement and attractiveness that would have made absorption practically unavoidable. For George, Callister's drawing inspiration from a thrillingly wide range of sources, including Frank Lloyd Wright, traditional Japanese minka, the old houseboats of Sausalito, and from the 19th century California barn and fisherman shack, was perfectly in line with his own sensibility. By the time of George's arrival at Callister's, the office, then in its 20th year, comprised some 50 architects with projects in the making for houses, churches, condominiums, and large-scale retirement communities, as would later be experienced by George himself, although to a lesser degree. In Callister's first work as an architect, he found the kind of recognition that others spend decades chasing. That first building, the Hull House from '47 in Kentfield, appeared in Life magazine shortly after completion. The year that George began working for him, Callister had a 10-page profile in the largest national architectural trade magazine, House and Home. And I'll quote, "Not since Maybeck has any Bay Region architect taken such delight in the imaginative use of painted wood to enrich and emphasize structure, to define and enliven planes, to dramatize handsome forms and spaces," wrote House and Home of Callister's unique and intensely personal houses. But for George, almost equal to the appeal of Callister's work was the vibe of the office itself, where George spent most of his hours working on projects, including the early example of cluster housing at the master plan community of Rossmore in Walnut Creek. Housed in a 1908 railroad barn in Tiburon, the Callister office in these years, despite widespread Bay Area civil rights protests and the spiraling instability of the situation in Vietnam, managed to be a dynamically creative and inspirited milieu, more studio of free thinking than corporate office place for business. The building's exposed timber frame walls were hung with avant-garde paintings by Callister clients such as the surrealist Gordon Onslow Ford, and with Aaron Copland playing in the background. There were the not infrequent Friday office parties where the associates would let their hair down and ponder the predicaments of the worlds outside of architecture. For George, as for the other young architects by his side, Callister's was indeed a firmament for intellectual exchange and confidence building, a safe haven in unstable times. Relative to George, it's important to point out that Callister had established himself on the basis of certain core principles, and in the defense of those ideas, he could be entirely uncompromising, if not stonewalling. When he had something fixed in his mind, one associate recalled, "You could argue, but he never ever wavered." George had learned from a master how to protect the integrity of his ideas, and it became the backbone of his pursuit of artistic excellence in the work. If, as the client, you objected to a fundamental aspect of George's for your house, you would be politely given an opportunity to make your case and be heard, but you were in for a bumpy ride if you were committed to changing his mind about it. With George, whether consciously or not, there are always two distinct timetables at play, yours and his. Among the Callister architectural principles that George made his own are, number one, the simplification of parts is essential. Use only a single exterior material and only one kind of door or window. Two, there's nothing inherently wrong with an emphasis on weight and mass, never mind Philip Johnson's and Alfred Hitchcock's prescription of an absolute emphasis on volume. Three, design so that a maximum number of decisions can be made in the field without hurting the design. And that one tended to get him into some trouble from time to time. Lastly, architecture is found by walking and listening to the site, not by preconceptions. This last point, preconceptions, especially in the case of George, should be taken to apply to both architect and client. The topic of preconceptions, getting ahead here, as they relate to architecture, houses especially, just like architecture is art, is yet another route to the minefield of subjectivity. However, here what we're really talking about are the intuitive rituals of sheltering. USC's Ralph Knowles wrote a brilliant book on the topic. To the process of planning and operating our houses, we inevitably bring our learned domestic behaviors, most of them originating and solidifying during childhood and early adulthood. For George, when it came to addressing those preconceptions of appropriate solutions for a project, just as it tended to be in the case of his core belief as architecture is art, the subjectivity involved in determining the good from the bad frequently led to the classic architect-client intellectual wrestling match. And I'm going to quote George here. He said, "They often feel comfortable with that, the preconceptions. They may like the unique and think of change, but they can't adjust. And consciously or unconsciously, they try to modify the plan or bring in some former thing. Whether it's having agreed upon a design and at a later time wanting to change it, or not allowing the interior to be consistent with the architectural statement, which normally would be very unified and harmonious. On the topic of client preconceptions, Warren Callister too spoke unequivocally. Each new idea about a detail or a part of the building, Callister said, or method of construction or material cannot be a thing in itself separate and unrelated to the first purposes of your design. You, the architect, must prevail over the frills that belong to the client. You must teach them. You must improve by the preaching that you can do with your architecture upon their momentary whims and superficial mannerisms. Don't submit to them or to the gadgets. You must be the poet first, the inventor last of all. The spiritual quality must prevail over all. And this is a classic bit of communication here from the master of masters. So the next point that I'm going to talk about is structure as form. George regarded structure as being the very substance of building. He had little interest in complex forms unrelated to structural function. Considering that in the first few decades of his career, he worked almost exclusively in heavy timber moment frame construction systems using a natural materials palette that included salvaged old growth redwood and fir. Expressing structure for George tended quite naturally and instinctively to be as much about the undeniable beauty of the building materials themselves as it was about form and structure comprising a harmonious whole. But George did indeed see structure and form as one, at least in the work of the first 3 decades. Each job was treated as an exercise in exploiting the form-generating possibilities of structure, such as they existed at the time, the pre-AutoCAD days. Under the umbrella of structure as form, George placed his agendas of an emphasis on space perception, of being sympathetic with the notion of a profound respect for nature, and of establishing in his buildings a minimum sense of separation from the elements. For George, mass, as it was more famously for Lou Kahn, was scrutinized as a question of structure. Kahn, whose work George greatly admired, was known to say that architecture had begun when the walls parted and the columns became. George, for his part, prized the 19th century California pole barn and the Norwegian Stav church equally, not for their respective historical or associative values necessarily, but for their purely intrinsical qualities. Structure and form united, uninhibited, unpretentious, proud. It would be fair to surmise that he might have taken a different approach to structure and form had he not landed where he did geographically in his first project as an independent practitioner, and in the series of similar type projects that followed it in the 2 decades thereafter. Designing for those spectacular sites, coastal wilderness settings in Big Sur, as well as for unspoiled highlands and Pebble Beach settings, similarly exposed to 100-mile-per-hour winds and other extreme weather, there was a need for the muscular. The buildings had to be anchored. For George in these projects, it was only logical to combine structural and aesthetic programs. In each project, determining the formal qualities were the house's structural frames, each of which George designed to complement the natural features of the site. At Rocky Point, the roofline echoes the adjacent crag. On a mostly flat expanse at Pebble Beach, the design of the system of columns and bracing is in quiet dialogue with the wind-blown cypress. In terms of his exploration of plan form, while he defined his work as being rooted in organic principles and held a deep interest in the sculptural aspects of a building, George didn't deal in biological metaphors, in anthropological shapes. He designed several radial plan houses, including the completed works of Stouty, Eastwood, Coker, and Fox, but the majority of the buildings utilize a less costly orthogonal grid. So next I'm going to talk about his views on materials. And we'll look at design intent, philosophy, and application thereof. George dreamt of a house that in the overall repeatedly utilized a few simple materials, usually glass, timber, and stone, to establish a rhythm and an understatedness contextually, while simultaneously in the intimate was possessive visually of a deeply layered tonal complexity and textural character. He labored intensely over a building's intellectual and visual effects, and to that end, the choice of materials for a design was of paramount importance. With building materials, George sought to directly acknowledge the terroir at hand, the very nature of the site in its totality. The things that appeal to me, he said, are the things that blend the most, that have the least impact on the environment. A current throughout George's heavy timber work is a presence of shibui, the Japanese concept of high beauty, of designing and building to exploit the essential characteristics of a material, but while emphasizing the condition of understatedness. In the bridge timber houses, we'll see this again and again. Most obviously, we find shibui in George's choice of deeply weathered salvage materials, materials that are in and of themselves imperfect, but which are assembled into a whole composition with the utmost care and attention. Great intention was behind the choice of patina, the textures, the tones, again, always with the goal of establishing a relationship between the building and what was already at the site naturally. Prettiness and perfection were of little interest to George. He wanted the appearance of his buildings to change over time. The clear heart redwood one-by planks that he used so frequently as siding were inevitably of the rough sawn type, which have an imperfect finish that would communicate texture and eventually patina. Finishes for exterior woodwork and interior woodwork were frequently the same. Ornamentation was derived from the construction details of the materials, as in the bolting of the timbers. In all, for George, the total value of a building was measured to a great extent by the subtle beauties of its materials as experienced in the natural context of the site. It wasn't unusual for George to be directly involved in the selection and application of materials for his jobs. A case in point is the Stouty House at Anderson Creek in Big Sur. In this instance, where the client was providing most of the required timber from a redwood bridge he had acquired, George nonetheless contributed certain key timbers from his own collection, and through the years he did maintain a very substantial collection, each of which he added to the ensemble at Stouty's because of the wood's particular qualities. George also traveled extensively to find and gather new material himself. Again, at Stouty, he found rock for artistic aggregate, concrete floors in San Rafael, fireplace and landscape rock he hauled himself out of Gorda in 3 separate trips. Terry beach rock for the roof of the house he collected at San Simeon. So before we close this section and move to the images of the work, I want to just provide a final note on his creative direction. Firstly, what I've been describing here thus far reveals a built-in bias toward visual effect, a bias shared both by George and his clients during those years, the first few decades of his practice. In '72, when the California legislature enacted what was then called the California Coastal Zone Conservation Commission, the emphasis on the visual was only heightened. But a redirection of priorities for architect and client was, of course, unavoidable after '78 with California's enactment of the Title 24 Building Energy Efficiency Standards. From the late '70s onward in George's work, as across the profession, the topic of physical function or environmental control necessarily becomes a dominant topic for all parties concerned, and it forces significant compromises in approach. But for George, more impactful than any governmental oversight of the work were the changes that were simply in the air starting in the first term of the Ronald Reagan presidency. During the '80s, the arts and crafts influence of Bernard Maybeck that had so colored the modernism of the First and Second Bay region tradition fell out of favor with consumers after a strong 5-decade run. It was at that moment when we began to see clear heart redwood being covered in white paint. In residential design, increasingly the influence of the interior decorator began to overshadow that of the architect. The very notion of beauty in the home was changing, and the architect was no longer the primary provider. For George, who for the first 20 years of his career had worked primarily in a single idiom, one that was close to his heart and had sustained his practice, survival suddenly depended on reinventing himself and on inventing a new architecture. George's reaction initially was to focus on commercial projects, and there he did find clients, including Eastwood. But George was destined to be an architect of houses, and in 1985, for Edward Keith in Pebble Beach, George landed that opportunity for reinvention that he so needed. The environmental reawakening of the mid-90s naturally re-energized George's outlook and practice. At least a dozen projects came through the office, though again, George could make it difficult for clients to follow through. The 2000s were comparatively slower, though significantly more rewarding for him on a personal level. It was during this time that he was asked by the Brook Kothlow's old friend, Jacqueline Woodward, to design a house for her in Carmel. And then in short order, in Carmel Valley, he was hired by Roger and Ann Blattberg to renovate the Joan Baez house, a 1963 John Gamble design that in the hands of owners who followed Baez had been badly neglected. George was elated by the opportunity to resuscitate the house where he and wife Jennifer and their children had lived prior to the building of their own place nearby. Finally, while Baez was being completed, George, now working in collaboration with architect Dennis Hodgen, was hired by the Traynor family to design a Carmel Valley house that would prove to be the largest and most complex project of his career. It was a career that spanned 6 decades and spawned dozens of successful buildings, work that largely has passed his own test, outlined in his 62 thesis, The Test of Time. So I'm going to go through some highlights of the work from 66 to 2013, and then we're going to look at some of the bridge timber work. This was an unbuilt design in collaboration with the late West Marin architect Dan Lieberman, who was a Taliesin apprentice, influenced not just by Wright, but by Bruce Goff. This is a house some of you will remember that is no longer, sadly.
What happened to it?
It burned. So this is an example of George's, I think, a kind of a conservatism that he had in certain ways. You know, many of you must know what ended up going in here by Mickey Munich with these earth-bermed structures that are very free-form and organic. So this is the house that was the real turning point for George that I spoke of. So the origins of this design kind of grow out of the water tank structures that Gary put up at the Coast Gallery. And this house was on the recent house tour. I assume many of you, or some of you, were a part of. Looks like some of these are cropped by the projection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the bridge timber houses because the salvage bridge timber house as a concept that's just so completely anomalous. It really must be experienced to be understood. Here you have a gigantic scale natural building material, on the West Coast typically old growth redwood or Douglas fir, that has been subjected to industrial processes in the preparation for strict infrastructural application. Irrespective of its great scale and manufacture, however, the material's life cycle is not indefinite. A certain degree of decay, not just when under stress, but also when utilized in a coastal environment, is one of its inevitable characteristics. In the 20s and 30s, in preparation for the 37 opening of the Carmel-San Simeon Highway, the state of California had erected a total of 31 bridges. 21 of those were timber, 7 were concrete arch, such as at Bixby, and the rest were steel. As you'd expect, the more isolated areas of the coast were the more difficult of the building sites, and for largely economic reasons, those usually received the timber bridges. Only a generation after these structures had been completed, by the middle 50s, California's exploding population and attendant automobile dependency had fatigued many of the more vulnerable of the spans, those built of timber. The timber bridges had been constructed using splice blocks and special metal connectors that effectively transmitted loads at the joint from one timber to another. The connectors also made the processes of assembly and in turn disassembly relatively uncomplicated and efficient. In the case of the original construction of Big Sur's Dolan Creek Bridge, timbers that would later be used in the realization of multiple houses in Monterey County. This is Dolan Creek, a model that was created. The timber for the arches had been framed and otherwise prepped and then entirely fitted together while lying on the ground in a Monterey dockyard, then dismantled and trucked down the coast highway to Dolan Creek for final assembly. As the compromised timber bridges were taken down and replaced with reinforced concrete spans, one by one, beginning in Big Sur with the Torrey Canyon Bridge in 54-55. In order to avoid the burden of transporting the material out of the area, it was common for those in charge of disassembly to try to locate a local source that would acquire the material, a preponderance of it well above the common structural grade for residential use standard. In 1965, Tony Stouty of Big Sur bought the redwood Buck Creek Bridge for $1,500 and later had a house built from those 6x20s. For a certain breed of architect of this period of salvaged bridge timber availability, and its availability only lasted about a decade, there was a clear and absolute attraction to the potentialities afforded by the bridge timber's inherent power of presence. But beyond just aesthetics, and reclaimed barnwood appeals and is applicable mostly on purely aesthetic levels, The bridge timber had the capacity of great structural integrity, and it communicated historical and associative values of place. The bridge timber house, this is Anderson Creek Bridge. You see how the timbers are spliced. The bridge timber house, its exposed structure interiors especially, is so unexpected relative to conventional residential construction that it forces us to stop and contemplate it, to put down the smartphone and take a close look and to think. George recognized that in building with bridge timber, he could create an architecture that arrived fully energized with story. A simple material, but an incredibly powerful material. So in prepping the timbers, I want to say just a few things about that. In order to even begin, you've got to have a metal detector, and you've got to go over each timber with a metal detector, because if it was very common for there to be nails or other pieces of metal in the timbers that when putting those through a bandsaw would destroy the machine. And George was billed by Fifes on more than one occasion for the destruction of their tools. Yeah, it's at the bottom there, you see one saw badly damaged by nail, $25. So as we'll see, the chronology of the bridge timber house begins with architect Mark Mills, who with his combined training in architecture and engineering was always one to explore outside the box structural systems. Mills was the one who had introduced bridge timber salvaged from the Torrey Canyon Bridge to Nat Owings for use in Wildbird in '56. That same year, William Hudson acquired part of the recently decommissioned Richardson Bay Bridge in San Francisco, then the longest redwood timber bridge in the world, and had the dense select structural Clearheart redwood trucked down to his site at Santa Lucia Ranch. This is an unbuilt Mills design from mid-50s. On the south elevation, you see where they used the bridge timbers. So the bridge timbers from Richardson Bay Bridge were used, the entire house was built from them. This house burned in the 80s and was rebuilt. This is an example from up north. And this was Mills working with timbers that he had acquired from Bill Hudson for the artist Lute Vanderveen. So Hudson's was the first of several Hudson family bridge timber houses from Dolan Ridge and Big Sur to Pebble Beach, including one for Mary Hudson by local architect Francis Palms Jr., and also Bill Hudson's own house in town by architect Bud Evenson of Holland Goodhue at the time. This is more of Lute Vanderveen's. Mills' own house. So that's a close-up of this. The top drawing where he's. And these are the houses I'm showing here are in Flanders. So in 1964, Carmel architect Will Shaw and his partner Glenn Cairns designed a small bridge timber house for movie producer Marty Ranzahoff during the production of The Sandpiper. Nearby, starting in '69, and using timbers from the Dolan Bridge, Shaw would design and build a substantial bridge timber house for himself and his wife. Also in Big Sur, starting in '68 and extending into the early '70s, a bridge timber house designed by former John Gamble associate Prudence Dusich of Carmel Valley was under construction for Dr. Jack Downing, an Esalen Institute psychiatrist. Dr. Downing's house was built with timbers from Hot Springs Creek Bridge, which had been decommissioned in '62, '63. There are other examples of bridge timber houses which involve other architects, but the most important strides were made by an architect, and the idiom belonged to George. Beginning in '66 with the commission for the Chapelets that we see here, and extending to 1990 with his house at Rocky Point, George kept evolving the idiom. It really was his. No other architect explored the aesthetic and technical possibilities of bridge timber for residential application in both salvaged and new timber to the extent that he did. So now we'll take a look at a full range, including houses by others in the region. So these are pictures that were done by Morley Bear that appeared in the 1969 Los Angeles Times Home magazine that sort of put George on the map. So originally he explored in this drawing, he was exploring doing Stouty as a two-story, which eventually was ruled out. Stouty is an interesting case because the Stoutys were notoriously difficult clients. They went through 4 different architects before finally settling with George. They had originally, they looked at their architect from Beverly Hills. He came up and didn't want to deal with bridge timber. They explored preliminary drawings with Will Shaw and Walter Bertie. They didn't connect. That was abandoned. They looked at Mark Mills and felt that he would be too uncompromising, at least in the opinion of Marguerite Stouty. And finally they did connect with George and proceeded, but it was a very, very challenging project in more ways than one. Some of you will remember Howard Carter, who did basically all the structural engineering in the peninsula. So the roof essentially floats on these cantilevered beams. There are no shear walls in the house. None of the walls reach the ceiling. There's clear stories all around. There's an interior gallery that really directs circulation through the plan, which you see in the background, but I'll show you another view. This is it here. So the house, Stouty house, as would be done in the Eastwood house, as Will Shaw did in his house, you've got this decorative exposed aggregate concrete by Brad Bowman that really adds so much to the ambiance. There's some of it there in the foreground. So this house has recently been restored by a new owner who hired Frank Pinney and his crew to really bring it back to life, and they did a fantastic job. This is the house that I mentioned by Carmel Valley architect Prudence Dusich, who's, I think, the only woman that did a bridge timber house. She had worked on the Baez house while employed with John Gamble. And I think through time at Esalen, she connected with Dr. Jack Downing and ended up getting the job to design this house. So here, the house was originally conceived of as partly for Eureka Institute training and for Dr. Downing's own private practice. And so there were going to be groups spending the night. So there were sleeping lofts that flank each side of the living room there that accommodate about 6 to 7 people each side. So this is Will Shaw's house, Will and Mary's house. So the Eastwoods had originally contracted with Walter Bertie and Will Shaw to do this house, and Bertie and Shaw drew up preliminaries, and the Eastwoods weren't satisfied, and they kept going round and round. Finally, having seen George's house for the Chapelets that was published in the LA Times, and then also seeing parts of the Stouty house, they said, well, can't you just bring in George to take part in the project? And so an agreement was formed, and Bertie and Shaw and George were partnered in the creation of this, which with George taking the lead in architectural design. And originally the Eastwoods wanted a very rough, they wanted a very rough look on the inside and on the outside. They wanted redwood timbers, as was the case at Stouty, but ultimately George had difficulty in finding enough timbers to do the house, and so they ended up finding Douglas fir out in Watsonville at the pallet maker George Bassey's place, and that's how they proceeded. So this was for the Mad magazine illustrator Paul Coker, who had envisioned actually doing work from this building and not being distracted by the view. I mean, it didn't quite work out. So this too is a radial building that's all directed off the top of the adjacent crag. So this was George's first house to go before Coastal Commission, and there was some back and forth, but eventually it was held up as one that would be a sort of a standard. And it paved the way in future projects for him to move a little bit more expeditiously through that red tape. Yeah, unfortunately, the projector is cropping these images in a way that doesn't reveal the entire picture, but so oftentimes George and his associates would create these 6 or 8 foot wide contextual drawings, perspective drawings, and roll them up and bring them down to the site to wow the client. And it usually worked. So here we see Dick Stratman and his crew on this project. Dick was the builder on this house. So I'd like to open it up to some questions if we can kind of raise hands and kind of go around. And I think there's probably quite a few people in the audience that can chime in as well. Does anyone have anything about anything we've seen so far or I've talked about so far?
We're going to bring the mic to everyone who wants to have a question, so go ahead.
Would it be possible for you to just speak about the architect instead of reading to us?
Oh, I'm sorry. There's the, what I wanted to try to provide was something that I needed to put on paper because I didn't want to just give you anecdotal stuff on George. I think people, yeah, I'm sorry. Anyone else?
Oh, let me come to you.
Yes.
I just recently went on the AIA Carmel Valley Heritage House tour where I saw the home that was featured in your presentation. Are any of these homes that you showed us that are like in the Big Sur area that are really these wow kind of structures against the cliffs, are they ever available on tour?
I think most of the homeowners in Big Sur are privacy seekers, to put it mildly. Just getting access to document them for my purposes, including showing them here, was not easy. And so sharing the kinds of information that maybe you would like to hear, in the case of most of George's clients, is simply not possible without signing an NDA, which I did in one instance. But these are houses that, Stouty was sold for, I think, $40 million, and originally built for a few $100,000. the people that own them now just don't want any exposure. That can be said across the board.
We'll keep trying, though.
We would. Yeah. If anyone would like to help in that regard? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Paul.
Hi, Richard.
Hi.
When's your new book coming out?
You know, that's a good question. I have to. We're trying to decide when would be a good time to release it. You know, the book business, the architecture and art book business, has taken a big hit as a result of COVID, and just the ability to get out and promote a book hasn't really been a realistic proposition lately. So, kind of waiting to see it. I've got so much invested in it that I'm not really in a big hurry to get it out. I want to get it out and get it out effectively. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Katie?
So I'm not very familiar with George Brook Kothlow's work, but the Trainer House seems really different than all the other ones stylistically, and I was wondering if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, that was a collaboration with his collaborator, I think, getting the upper hand for the most part, because it was completed during George's last year, or it was partially completed. It was really completed after he passed. So I know that from discussions with George and with Dennis Hodgen, who was his collaborator, and also with Alfred Seacombe, who was the builder, that the client wanted something very different from what George typically built or typically designed. So there was a lot of push and pull, and it was difficult for George, but he wanted to see it through, and it was a project that I think it's a testament to his ability to be flexible, which for much of his career he had difficulty with that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a completely it's a big departure from everything else he did.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on and questions. So I did George's last two houses that he designed. The Trainer one and the other one, after he passed away, was kind of a rebuild of a house he designed in the 70s. One thing, comment on the Trainer project. Well, first of all, I want to talk about a common element. One common element in those two houses are a long. Each one had a 100-foot long, 20-foot high hallway. On the Trainers, it was in the house, and on the rebuild, it was an exterior walkway. Which was kind of interesting because actually the roof went over the house, and there was a walkway on the back side. So I was kind of asked Richard. I saw this. It's kind of like the spines that in the John Thodas work. That's very similar. This thing that kind of ties everything together. So I was questioning, if this was something that was a theme throughout his career, and which was interesting. Richard sent me the floor plan and elevation of the house that this rebuild was designed after, and the spine was in fact not in the original house. So that's where I was thinking, here's this thing from the beginning and the end that's the same, but what actually happened is George apparently introduced, in other words, he redesigned this final redesign with this same element that was in his last house. There was another common theme in those where the way the windows were, they had these 2-foot deep walls under the windows, and then the French doors, it was just identical. And I was looking, and I really wasn't seeing that much. It wasn't really obvious in any of the other drawings. So I guess what I realized after you sent me those is the reason why those were the same was it was just the way he was thinking then, and he took his current thoughts and introduced them back into this rebuild.
Yeah, his process was rather rigorous, and he wouldn't have allowed a design to go out without another review of it and some modification that would be specific to the new client. He just wouldn't have done that. He probably put far too much time into adapting it than he needed to. Yeah.
I have a question just about the process and how he would interact with the site itself to get his inspiration. Can you talk about that a little bit, or maybe people that, like David, who worked with them, could talk about how much time he spent there, this kind of sketching he might have done, and how that created the form of the house?
Yeah, I wonder if David has some thoughts on that. You know, he's right over here.
Not to put you on the spot, but.
Richard's already talked a little bit about George being difficult to actually pull out of him what the principles were that he was using on a specific project, what we would call the kind of design principles. And sometimes, at least when I was working with him, I would write those down as best I could determine them. For instance, on the Coker house, you know, that as we expanded from the studio on the side to the main house, some of those principles were clearly evident, at least to me, and so I wrote them down. I think we had 5 or 6 kind of what I called sort of irreducibles to guide the process. But one of the things that George said, he spent a lot of time on the site, as I did also. So we certainly were synchronous in that sense, doing site walks, sitting and meditating, frankly, sometimes with the clients and sometimes without. So that was an important part of his process, was what structure wants to be built on this site, you know, with these materials. And so that was that's part of what architecture is all about, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly George exemplified that throughout his project.
Thank you for the presentation, and I heard that you mentioned part of his design process was emphasized on experiencing the site and the landscape and hearing it, and I was curious to know if because I have not been to any of his projects, if you have been to his buildings that is designed, what was outstanding about that experience on site, and also I was curious to know what things you found as kind of weaknesses, or if any, you know, points that could get improved in those buildings. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question, and I touched on it a little bit in the talk, and it really, pre-Title 24, everyone was preoccupied with the visual, and in the Coker studio that David was talking about, which is the house that is at Rocky Point that I showed, the little studio there next to the rock outcropping, it faces due west, and the glare was a real problem for the owner, Paul Coker. He was planning on doing illustration work in the house, and the glare was such a problem because the overhang was only about 18, 20 inches. It wasn't quite adequate, but really facing west, he couldn't have created a big enough overhang. It's always going to be an issue. So sunlight. So especially coming off the ocean, the glare is almost unbearable. It's what Bill Worcester used to call the light that kills. So George, like most people, most architects who were working during that era, was focused on the visual, and that's what the clients were concerned with. Really, California clients were, up until the late 70s, weren't willing to splurge on insulation. So a lot of George's buildings are uninsulated. He would typically use rigid insulation on the roof. After 74, he started using bad insulation, as in the Solomon House at Buck Creek, a bridge timber house. But largely, no one was really willing to spend on that because they felt like they were living in California. The weather's idyllic all the time. So could be 110 in the valley and 55 at the coast, and everybody thinks they've got the same climate. So that's that's one answer for you. It just wasn't a concern in terms of protecting the house thermally, and so there were some shortcomings in that respect. But visually, the houses, there's a commonality that they all are very deeply interwoven into the context of the site in terms of natural materials.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate your discussion of his work. The Keith House, which you mentioned was the change in his style in 1986.
85, 86.
85, 86. I've spent 5 years of my life making that house waterproof. So my curiosity is, why did he change so much from the bridge timber construction to that modern, Mr. You called it a water tank with windows.
No, that was another house.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, same, whatever, same deal. So that particular house is like nothing that he had done before, nothing.
Right, right.
And I mean, it's completely different. And Mr. Keith, when he ordered the house from George, said he wanted, his wife wanted the Garden of Eden. She wanted to see the Garden of Eden, and he wanted the Starship Enterprise. Yeah. So I know this.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah.
So that's what happened.
Right.
So I'm kind of curious if you know anything.
Why such a drastic departure, you're asking?
Exactly. Thank you.
From my time at Architectural Digest, I can tell you with certainty that there was in the early 80s, after the first few years of the 80s, there was a recession. Following that, there was the interior decoration business really blew up. And at that point, there was a very dramatic shift in emphasis from the architect to the interior decorator. And that's only been compounded in decades since. But at that time, George was sensing that. And really, George was not interested in decoration. He was interested in built-in interiors. He was interested in minimalistic interiors that really showcase the architecture, like a lot of architects. That change was necessary for him to keep going. And he very fortunately secured this client who was interested in doing something very different. There wasn't another client lined up to do another bridge timber house. That the interest in the woodsy aesthetic disappeared. Now, that may sound unusual to people who live in Carmel, but living in Los Angeles, where I live, I can tell you with absolute certainty that there was a shift, a very marked shift, and it was a matter of survival for George. And he adapted, and through the 90s, you see that he continued in that direction until the environmental reawakening of the mid-90s started to re-energize his old thinking a little bit about how he might be able to present concepts to clients. But it was, in short, it was a necessity for him, as it was for everyone who was working in a woodsy mode at that time.
That shift that you were just talking about, do you think that has a lot to do also with the publishing business? That during that time, actually, magazines like AD and other design magazines became so prevalent and throughout the society here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's hard for me to put too much behind that when you consider the success and popularity of House Beautiful in the 1940s and 50s. You know, that was really a ubiquitous presence. But decoration became a thing in the 80s as never before. So that was absolutely part of it. You know, interior decoration was something that was, you know, was new for a new generation was coming into that. And it was no longer just the 1 or 2% that were decorating their homes. In the 80s, suddenly you get the middle class looking to taking interest in high art decoration.
Do you think there's a shift going back to more serious architecture?
Gosh, you know, where the shift has gone a decade ago and where it continues to go is in the direction of whatever a celebrity does is what we need to do. That's where the magazines have gone, and unfortunately, you know, they haven't decided to step away from that yet. It's been 10 years now, I think, since that really changed.
I'm just wondering about George's thoughts about having his buildings photographed. It looked like he used Molière in the beginning of at least one of the houses you showed. And did he document any of the other great bridge timber homes in that way that we might be able to enjoy?
He had Tom O'Neill do some pictures when he was going before the Coastal Commission with the Chemnitz house. Tom lived in Carmel Valley at the time. He wasn't really publicity minded. You know, he was a small shop and was really going full tilt with the work. When he was working, it was all about creating the work and very little about promoting it. And I think certainly had he hired a publicist, and he definitely needed the help in that regard, he would have been much more successful and much more in demand beyond this region. He would have found attention, I think, nationally. But it just didn't work out that way for him. And when I got to Architectural Digest, the first year I went looking in their files for projects related to the architects that I have always been interested in, including Mark Mills and George. And I found that George's house at Rocky Point had been accepted for publication for an architecture issue, and then subsequently killed after the editor-in-chief revisited the interiors and felt that the interiors weren't up to par for the magazine. So this was in 1991. So that gives you, again, it's what I was saying earlier about there was this new emphasis on interiors over everything else. And so, yeah, that was the one project that I think he felt like, okay, I can get out and really try to push this a little bit. And he wrote a beautiful description of it for AD, which I made copies of, and it didn't go anywhere.
Any other questions?
My first thought is to acknowledge Richard for being a younger guy able to grasp all the way back to the 70s when this began. This story is incredible for me because I arrived in California in 72, met the Stouties in 73, and made my first contribution to a George Brook Kothlow house when my partner and I cut 6-inch slabs from what the Stouties wanted at the time was not redwood rounds, but redwood amoeba, the fluted base of a large tree. And we found a tree to do that. And that was my first involvement with George at the time, only through the Stouties, so I got to know them. I finally met George later in experience when the Eastwood house was being built, and George wanted some redwood slab for the interior, and that fit with the whole bridge structure. But what I'd like to ask Richard is, I don't know the other folks that are in the business of doing what you do, but from my observation of what you do total immersion. You are the pig with 3 legs in this business. And I just was curious if you have, in your broad scope and all the way back to Architectural Digest days, where would you place the bridge timber, how can I say, the bridge timber concept and what you've seen here among the panoply of architectural styles and artistic blending? If you have a way of rating or how you would summarize what you've learned from this experience.
Well, I sort of equate it as a relative of the steel-framed houses of the 50s of Craig Elwood and even of Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. You know, it's almost a Californian equivalent, and you know, it unfortunately for architects like George and for Mark Mills, the East Coast controlled architectural publishing, and instead of publishing a house by, you know, the Staudy house, which is so worthy, you know, they would publish a Richard Meyer house, and you know, and George, and also there was the issue of the lingering issue of the popularity of the Sea Ranch, which became a nationwide style. And you know, George had argued in the 70s that the Sea Ranch was that architecture wasn't even appropriate for that environment, that the absence of overhangs makes the houses almost unlivable. And if you look at any of the old pictures, you see that all the interior, all the blinds are always closed in all the pictures in those houses. And so, you know, there was that. But to answer your question, I really think that the bridge timber houses were sort of the Californian equivalent of the steel-framed houses of the mid-century, and they've just been overlooked because there isn't the press out here to really pay attention to them, and hasn't been for a while.
Oh, thank you. I noticed that on some of the houses, the bridge timber houses, there was some really nice artistic detail on the design of the interior in the kitchens and throughout the house that was beautiful. And does anyone do that nowadays?
Yes, but you know, I think one point to keep in mind is that finding the talent to execute that work has become increasingly difficult. And you know, certainly we see it in Los Angeles, where I live in Laurel Canyon, and we can't even get a contractor to come to our house to take a look at a project. They won't even show up because they're so busy. So it really it's come down to the talent. I mean, there was a time in the 70s where college graduates were coming out and going into and trying to be artist carpenters. You know, people who had studied art, studied painting or sculpture, were coming out and discovering they could actually make much better money doing carpentry and construction. And there was a movement of individuals like that that lasted into the early 80s. But then, like George's work, you know, the change occurred. So yeah, it's hard to find someone who can execute at that level, but there are some, and there's one here tonight whose crew can do it and have proven to be able to do it. And yeah, hard to find.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great presentation, by the way, thank you. On the bridge timber houses, were these timbers ever milled to different dimensions, or they were kept true to what they were milled for the bridge, for the patina?
It varied. It varied. You know, as I mentioned, the Eastwoods originally wanted a very rough-hewn look, and then they changed their mind and decided they wanted the timbers hewn. And you know, George worked with salvage timbers and then also new wood at the bridge timber scale. And so it just varied. You know, some clients, like the Staudys, like the Chapelets, wanted that very deeply rustic look, the deep weathered patina. But yeah, it varied from client to client. And it's a lot to live with. I mean, it really it colors your whole experience of an interior, good and bad.
Okay. I'm going to let this be our last question since we want to enjoy some wine and cheese afterwards, and you can ask more questions directly of Richard after that.
I had a question about getting photographs and all that kind of stuff. It seems like, people, they build these houses and then they're taking all these pictures of themselves standing in front of half-built houses and all that kind of stuff. And then they get old and they die. And what happens to all those photos, Because I feel like there's not enough photos of George's houses, in the whole process and then afterward. It's kind of a mysterious thing to me.
Yeah, well, it goes back to people a lot of people not just wanting any attention or publicity. And now with social media being what it is, I don't do social media just so that I can actually work with this kind of material. Because if I had an Instagram page and posted every time I went to one of George's houses, for example, those people wouldn't allow me to come back again. That's something that's a conscious decision that I've made, not to put myself out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, all of it, so that I can work with the kinds of architecture that I like. And it is usually people that don't want attention. So.
Last question. Have you done a book?
Yeah, I did. The last book came out in 2012, and I have another book that's completed, ready to go, and hopefully it will come out in the next year or two. It's being published by a company called Rizzoli in New York, and it'll be available worldwide when it finally gets out. You're welcome.
Okay, thanks so much, Richard.
You're welcome.
That was a wonderful lecture.
I thought I was going to get beat up by that.
So thank you so much for participating in our arts and architecture community. We are busy planning for 2022, so I hope to see people back. And if you're not on the mailing list, please talk to Charmaine outside and get your name down, and we'll make sure to send you the information about it. And please enjoy the wine and food reception.